I'm Anant Ahuja, co-founder and CEO of Good Business Lab. And on behalf of everyone at GBL, I just wanted to thank you for contributing to our new thought leadership platform, GBL Access, where we're on a mission to provide our growing community with research insights from the field and beyond to drive business actions. Katrina, it's great to have you on. It would be great if you could, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and your work.
Sure. It's so great to be here. I'm Katrina Gordon. I work at Humanity United. I've been there for about 3 years. Initially, I was working and was able to get to know Good Business Lab through a innovation fund that Humanity United was running with the UK DFID group, which is supporting supply chain innovation, different tools and services, really bringing transparency to supply chains around the world. And so currently I'm working on taking those learnings about all those different kinds of tools and services and sets of data that exist. And I'm now focused on integrated open approaches to data so that many different stakeholders can utilize data, can contribute to data, and use that to hold corporations accountable.
That's so nice to hear. Thank you. And so, well, let's get right into it. I think our audience may not be so familiar with Humanity United and even some of the areas of work that you're leading. So I know that Humanity United has two portfolios, peace building and forced labor and human trafficking. You're more involved in the forced labor and human trafficking, but could you sort of help our audience who may not be familiar with this work to understand the meaning of these sort of terms and the scope of the work that you're leading in a bit more detail?
Sure. So I would say most folks are really familiar with Humanity United peace building work.
Okay.
That's really centered around supporting locally led peace building initiatives, as well as innovative networks, practices, and policies that elevate the voices of local peace builders in international conversation. So really having focuses in South Sudan, Zimbabwe, and Mali, and working with different entrepreneur groups and leaders there. On the other side of the organization is the Forced Labor and Human Trafficking group. And that's where our work with global supply chains is centered. And that has similarly been focused on different kinds of power imbalances, in this case between workers, corporations, and also governments that can come in to help to manage those imbalances and really to protect vulnerable workers that are within these large systems with so many different kinds of actors. I can say a bit more. So in 2019, we did an analysis of this forced labor and human trafficking system, which helped us to identify 8 different leverage areas where HU could play a role to eradicate the worst forms of human exploitation. And since then, we've continue to conduct and review research, engage with workers, businesses, donors, policymakers, and others in the field to absorb the lessons and really try to see where we can challenge our existing programs and either evolve or ramp up, ramp down different ones. So all of this has led to a culmination in our latest strategy, which focuses on 3 different leverage areas. Mm-hmm. The first being safer migration, which also focuses on workers. Our hypothesis there is that for this leverage area, if we can expand access to safer labor migration pathways for workers, then we can start to reform the precarious experience of migration and reduce migrant workers' vulnerability to exploitation. This is alongside worker agency. Their hypothesis is that if we support workers' ability to organize and act collectively, then we can shift existing power dynamics towards greater agency for workers and decrease worker vulnerability to exploitation. This is one of my favorite, with new forms of worker organizing and active participation in management, and also enabling environment with challenging that enabling environment with government and business policies to protect workers. And the last one is corporate accountability. And for that, we hypothesize that if we cultivate the conditions for stakeholders to hold corporations accountable for fair labor practices, then corporations will institute a new standard of corporate supply chain practice that really demonstrates greater corporate accountability for labor exploitation. And so for that, you may have heard of Know the Chain, which is a benchmarking platform that came about to really just list out the 40 largest public companies and bring light to their labor practices for use of investors and other financial actors. So yeah, trying to engage on all these different fronts, which we know aren't operating cleanly, but are definitely
Right.
mutually reinforcing.
Right.
So yeah.
No, that's really interesting. And thank you for explaining that in a way that's so clear. It definitely shows the, evolution of thinking that must have occurred at HU over the many years you guys have been working with supply chains. And I think in this moment, as the world is, trying to recover from this pandemic, the effects that it's had on the supply chain, we're still unpacking a lot of this. I think everyone is obviously experiencing the pandemic in their own way, but when we think about sort of, some of the common, trends or experiences people have had, whether it's, how we're both sort of working from home, and we were just talking about that before. And then we think about that same experience for workers in supply chains, it can obviously be a very different kind of thing. So what I wanted to ask next was just if you could, tell us a little bit more about how, the sort of the way in which an organization like HU has essentially, thought through the challenges of the pandemic, and how some of your work has maybe either shifted or adapted to address these new concerns.
Yeah, definitely. So two areas of work that really popped up for us were focused on really a rapid response and strategic response as well.
Yeah.
So for that, we feel very lucky. We were able to take a lot of the budget that we had for operating expenses and also travel that didn't happen. And so we were able to create a responsive emergency fund. So in 2020, we had a $2.3 million fund that was allocated to about 50 organizations, and also was able to serve as support to a number of other organizations in non-financial ways. But we were able to give either sponsorships or general operating support grants with minimal formal reporting requirements for grantees. I think we learned a lot through the engagements that these are organizations that are on the ground doing the work. And so the more as funders, the more we could allow them to do the work and engage in other ways other than with formal lengthy reports and extra conversations, the better that would be. So that was last year. And then this year, we've been able to allocate about $670,000 to support grantees, partners, and community organizations that are also responding to COVID crisis continued fallout. I think more broadly, we've been reading the same news and talking to partners in the field that just keep emphasizing how much has changed with orders being canceled or discounts, taking longer to pay from businesses, wages being withheld, forced overtime, factories shutting down and illegally opening back up, and migration of workforce halted or moved to more informal channels. And so, we've we've seen this like excessive power or money of corporations continuing, and just really highlighting the need for worker organizing and civil society support to workers. So, aside from allocating a large amount of funds and allocating in different ways to our partners, we've really seen this just as others opening their eyes or waking up to what we've been working on so far. And so, it's been nice to be able to have different kinds of actors like business or companies say, we want to know what's coming from where and how it was produced, in a way that hasn't happened before. And so, also trying to find the companies that are, doing the right thing and trying to leverage those as good examples, continuing to try to do those as well.
Yeah, totally. So, what I'm hearing is that although the consequences of the pandemic have truly been devastating, one thing they have done is sort of affirmed the importance of the work that HU is doing in similar organizations. And it sounds like, now maybe more than ever, whether it's companies or individuals or different actors, they're realizing that this approach and this work in specific is a really valuable investment for organizations to make. Is that kind of, what you've observed as well?
Definitely, yeah. And I think it's, I don't want to call it an opportunity, but I think there is space now to have these different kinds of conversations, to think about potentially more local government and regulation,
Sure.
and have less of a focus just on Western companies and their behavior, but really think about the producing countries and what economies look like there. I think that shift and is a productive one to be able to bring more light to where these things are happening and how they're happening.
Yeah, totally. I mean, going back to something you said earlier, or you referenced, obviously in the sort of, height of the pandemic or in the beginning, we saw, in many different industries, waves of, cancellation of orders, these challenges between brands and retailers and their suppliers. In the apparel industry, it was a big conversation, of course, with around sort of payment terms and so on. And I think, from what I've read and understood about HU's work, obviously, part of your thinking comes from this idea of how supply chains have evolved over time, how, you have these markets of consumption in countries and then supply chains in completely different locations. And then that distance creates a sense of like lack of transparency. But then when things, when issues become this extreme, when we see order cancellations and the impacts on the supply chain, then people become more aware of the problems.
Definitely, I couldn't agree with that more. I think it's it's interesting. There's an impact investment fund called the Working Capital Fund, and that was incubated through the HU Foundation and has since spun out. But just it's a fund with a portfolio of really interesting supply chain tools. And just in speaking with them, they have been sharing how a lot of their tools have so much more demand now, because companies want to know what's happening in their supply chains, and they want that new transparency, and really to understand the health and safety risks of workers, how they're being treated, and what the working conditions are like in a different way. So it's such an interesting thing to come out of this really challenging situation, but really hoping to have that transformation and evolution of the industry.
Yeah. And I think, for people who aren't necessarily familiar with supply chains in general, just to use the term sort of broadly, I think the concern around these issues is becoming, way more mainstream with the headlines we're seeing through the past year. But I guess just to help understand sort of what we mean when we're talking about HU's work in this space. Could you sort of maybe share a little bit more about, or help break down kind of the different actors, the different people you would directly work with? I know that, part of the way you're thinking about your work is interventions or improvements in sort of the employer-employee relationship, or almost, or at least the way that companies and workers sort of interact with each other. But from what I understand, you're not necessarily working directly with businesses. So maybe you could break that down for us a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say that I'll start with like our guiding star. We
Sure.
take like a systems approach. And
Yeah,
so
please.
like guiding star of what we're focused on is a transformed labor system, systems that are safe and fair for the most vulnerable workers. And yeah, that it takes form of working with different kinds of partners, whether they're nonprofits, social enterprises, different kind of actors that can help us to engage with companies, workers, and policymakers that play a leading role in changing those conditions that enable forced labor in private economies. And so for us, as a foundation, our work can take many different forms. At a very simple level, we make grants to different partners.
Sure.
And so that may be, a single grant, a series of a few over time. Sometimes it means just really supporting the work with different kinds of support through networks, sharing, support, encouraging more engagement between different partners. Sometimes just bringing two individuals to the table that weren't talking before. We like to assist not just with the actual funds, but in convening and also supporting different kinds of research that can be used to bring these issues to light.
Yeah.
I can give a few examples of some of our partnerships that we've, especially through the pandemic and the last year, really just sought to enforce.
That'd be great.
So we have a few strategic partnerships, one with the Freedom Fund, which is a collaborative of donors. They have a hotspot model with different areas around the world that they focus on. Another one that we recently joined over the last year is called Forge, Funders Organizing for Rights in the Global Economy. And that it's a different donors such as Loudest Foundation, formerly CNA Foundation, Open Society Foundations, Wellspring, and Ford. And that one's interesting though, because there's an emphasis on DEIJ, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, in order to seek a greater diversity of perspectives on this forced labor and human trafficking system. Also trying to deepen our relationships with a few key grantees whom we work with across our leverage areas, but in a program-based fashion. So there is Hey, which does a lot of the in-field work. It's an NGO that we really look to for the expertise on what's actually happening. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center, they're the ones that help to, and will be taking over the work of the chain benchmark. And then just so many other grantees, it's hard to choose, but just trying to engage with them and see what they need and how we can support during this time, because I know it looks different.
Yeah. No, thanks for that.